Teachers often wonder how you can measure text complexity, and there really are a few things that need to be considered when you get into that. Certainly, one of the obvious ways of measuring text complexity is something called a readability measure or a readability formula. There are a bunch of these. In fact, since the early 1920s, when psychologists first started studying how do you measure text difficulty, folks have come up with literally hundreds of these scales. Probably the most popular one right now is the Lexile, but it's just one of many measures. These readability measures allow you to estimate a text difficulty or predict a text difficulty in quantitative terms. They measure something structural about the text, and then they try to use those measurements to predict how well someone is likely to comprehend. Typically, readability measures of that type index two aspects of the text. They measure how unfamiliar the vocabulary is likely to be, and they measure how complex the sentences are. There are many other aspects of a text that might make a text difficult or easy, but they can actually do a pretty good job of predicting text difficulty. Pretty good job, not perfect. What that means is sometimes they're going to say a text is really hard when it turns out to be easier than you'd expect. Or they'll say a text is going to be somewhat easy, and when you get in there and try it out with students, you might find out that there are challenges that it missed, which means you have to turn your attention to some other aspects of the text. Those formulas can make a good prediction with only a couple of variables, but in fact there are other variables that make a text complicated. For example, the cohesive structure, how the sentences link with each other. John went to the circus. He went with his sister. Who is he in the second sentence? You have to make the connection between John and he. The greater the distances and the more choices that you have to fill that in, the harder the text becomes. Try to read, for example, a line of dialogue in a Hemingway short story or a Hemingway novel and watch how fast the students get lost and can't remember who's talking at a given time. It's useful to maybe start out with something like a quantitative measure of difficulty and then turn to look at some of these other aspects of how the text is organized and how subtle its tone is and those kinds of measures, which have to be done qualitatively. Somebody has to read the book and say, wow, this is very challenging content, and it's probably harder than the language would suggest, so that you can adjust those difficulties. Of course, there are always those aspects of the negotiation between the student and the text that are really due to much more what the student knows or local issues. And so, for example, if you're reading about a topic that your students are likely to know a lot about, it doesn't matter necessarily what the text features are. The students will probably do better because of the advantages that prior knowledge gives them. Of course, the opposite is true too. You might think a book is perfect for 9th graders, but that your 9th graders don't know very much about this, and that might lead you to adjust the book up or down a bit. The fact is, when it comes to choosing text, you need both these. You need all three of these. You need the qualitative formulas. You need a more subjective qualitative analysis of the text to see if there's some features that maybe make the book harder or easier than you would have predicted. And you also have to look at those local kinds of issues. Are there things that your students know or can do that maybe makes this text a little bit harder or a little bit easier than the prediction would suggest?